HOA put 23 lake cabins on my private island. I let them finish, then pulled out the deed in court. Yeah, you heard that right. The HOA actually built 23 luxury lake cabins on my island. They thought it was community property. They thought they could rent it out, collect the money, and boss me around. So I smiled, let them finish every single cabin, right down to the fancy decks and solar panels. And when the grand opening came, I walked right into court, pulled out the original deed, and watched their faces turn white. This is the story of how the HOA tried to steal my land and ended up building me a small resort for free. So grab your popcorn because this one's wild. And hey, before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below if you love seeing HOA karma served cold. It all started one quiet morning when I took my boat across the lake to check on my property, my private island. I'd bought that island years ago after saving every penny I could from my contracting business. It wasn't huge, but it was perfect. Just me, the pines, and the sound of waves hitting the rocks. No neighbors, no traffic, no HOA. At least, that's what I thought. But that morning, something didn't look right. As my boat got closer, I noticed the sound of engines, hammering, chainsaws, laughter. And then I saw them. People. A whole crew. They were wearing matching vests that said Lakeview Community Association. My stomach dropped. HOA. I cut the motor and coasted to the dock, except the dock wasn't mine. My old wooden pier was gone, replaced by a fancy aluminum dock lined with red flags and plastic fencing. And right there at the end of it stood a woman with a clipboard and sunglasses, pointing and barking orders like she owned the place. When I stepped onto the dock, she turned and gave me a polite but tight smile. "Excuse me, sir. This area is under construction. Private property." I stared at her. "Yeah," I said. "I know. It's mine." She blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "My island," I repeated. "I bought it 10 years ago, got the deed, title, everything." The clipboard woman laughed, actually laughed, and said, "I think you're mistaken. This land belongs to the Lakeview Homeowners Association. It was approved as a community development project last year." I said, "Approved by who? The lake doesn't even have a community on this side." She gave me a look like I was a lost tourist. "We've been expanding. These are Phase 4 cabins, all within the community jurisdiction." I just stood there, staring at the 20 or so wooden frames going up behind her. Cabins. Real cabins. Workers hammering, cutting, wiring. My forest cleared. My trails flattened. My land. Gone. I tried to stay calm. I said, "Listen, slowly. There must be some mistake. I own this island outright. No liens, no disputes. It's private land, always has been." But she just waved at a few workers. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Construction zones are dangerous. You can take it up with the HOA board." That was the first time in my life I felt invisible on my own property. I left that day furious, but quiet. I didn't yell, didn't threaten, just got back in my boat, motored away, and started digging through my old filing cabinet for the original papers. Sure enough, there it was. The deed, stamped and notarized, in my name. My island. I called the county office that afternoon. The clerk looked it up and confirmed it. "Yes, sir. The island is registered to you. No transfer, no dispute, nothing." So how in the world was an HOA building on it? The clerk suggested I call the HOA directly. So I did. I got the same woman on the line. Turns out her name was Karen. No joke. HOA president. She told me their developers acquired the island through what she called community mapping expansion. "Community mapping?" I said. "That's not a legal term." She just sighed. "It's complicated. The HOA board voted to include the island as part of the Lakeview perimeter. It's within our recreational zoning radius now. The cabins are for community rentals." I said, "You built 20 cabins on private property without permission. You can't do that." Karen's tone went from polite to smug. "Mr. Miller, you can't own nature. The island is within the community's natural reserve plan. We're protecting and enhancing it." "By cutting down trees and building luxury cabins?" I snapped. She didn't even flinch. "We're providing access to residents who deserve lakefront experiences. Don't make this difficult." And just like that, she hung up. That night, I sat on my porch looking out across the lake. I could see lights flickering on the island, generators humming. My heart sank. Every tree, every corner of that land, I'd cleared it by hand when I bought it. I'd spent weekends camping there, dreaming about building a little retreat someday. Now, it looked like a construction site run by strangers who thought I didn't exist. I could have stormed over, called the cops, but I had a better idea. I decided to let them finish. You see, Karen and her HOA thought I was just some clueless hermit with an old piece of paper. They had no idea that I worked in real estate contracting for over 20 years. I knew exactly what unauthorized development meant. I knew what kind of fines, penalties, and legal nightmares they'd face once it was all done. So I waited. Over the next few weeks, I pretended to be gone. I didn't call again, didn't send letters. Instead, I started documenting everything. Every time I saw a new cabin go up, I took photos from my drone. Every time a barge hauled lumber across the water, I logged the date and time. Every generator, every septic tank, every dock post, all recorded. By midsummer, the island was almost unrecognizable. 23 cabins stood neatly in rows, each with a shiny tin roof and a big deck facing the lake. They even built a community hall in the center, complete with solar panels, satellite internet, and Lakeview Island Resort signs. That's when I knew. They were making money off my land. So I made my move. First, I contacted a lawyer, an old friend named David. He specialized in property law. I showed him the deed, the photos, the drone footage, and the HOA's promotional material. He looked through everything, then leaned back and said, "Oh, this is gonna be fun." We filed for a property injunction immediately. The county clerk froze all construction permits linked to the island. Then we set a court date. I didn't tell the HOA a word. Let them keep building. Let them keep spending. The day before the hearing, Karen herself called me again, probably after she got wind of the injunction. Her tone was different now, a little nervous, a little defensive. "Mr. Miller, there seems to be some confusion about property boundaries. We were told the island was part of community jurisdiction." "By who?" "Well, our planning consultant. It was an internal process." "So no county approval?" Silence. Then she said, "Look, maybe we can work something out. The HOA is willing to compensate you for your, inconvenience." I almost laughed. "You mean you want to buy the land you already built on?" She tried to sound professional. "We could make a generous offer. Think of it as, mutually beneficial."
I said, "Karen, I'll think about it. See you in court tomorrow." When the morning came, the courtroom was packed. HOA board members, attorneys, a few community residents, all whispering as I walked in. I kept quiet, carrying a thick folder of documents under my arm. Karen sat on the opposite side, wearing her usual sunglasses indoors, tapping her pen like she owned the place. The judge started the hearing, asking for opening statements. Their lawyer went first, claiming the HOA had lawfully extended development to unutilized community land for the benefit of residents. When it was our turn, my lawyer stood, smiled, and handed the judge a copy of the original deed. "Your Honor, this land has been privately owned by my client, John Miller, since 2014. The HOA never purchased it, never leased it, and never received authorization to develop on it." The judge frowned and flipped through the documents. And you have proof of construction without consent? David nodded and pulled out the drone photos. Every cabin, every dock, every pipeline, all built on Mr. Miller's island without his permission. We have timestamps, permits, and promotional material from the HOA itself proving they used his property for commercial gain. Karen shifted uncomfortably. The room got quiet. The judge looked over her glasses and said, "Mrs. Karen, do you have documentation proving the HOA owns this island?" Karen's lawyer fumbled through a folder and finally produced a community zoning map. But when the judge looked closely, she raised her eyebrow. "This map isn't an official county record. It's printed from the HOA's website." Karen stammered, We were under the impression—" The judge cut her off. "Impression is not ownership." I sat there trying not to smile. And that's where I'll leave part one. Right at that moment, when the entire HOA realized they weren't the ones in control anymore. Because in part two, you'll see exactly what the judge ordered, how I flipped their luxury cabins into my rental business, and how the HOA ended up paying me every single month for land they tried to steal.
When the judge looked up from the papers and fixed her gaze on Karen, you could have heard a pin drop. The whole courtroom went silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan above us. "Mrs. Karen," the judge said, in that calm voice judges use right before they drop a hammer, "I see no legal documentation that your HOA owns or has any jurisdiction over this island. Do you have a deed?" Karen tried to speak, but her voice came out shaky. "Your Honor, we were under the impression that the land was unclaimed." The judge cut her off again. "Unclaimed? Mr. Miller's deed is registered with the county, notarized, and updated with property taxes paid every single year. That doesn't sound unclaimed to me." Karen's face went pale. Her lawyer started whispering in her ear, but she just stared at me like I was the one who'd stolen her property. I sat back, calm, hands folded. I'd waited months for this moment. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Miller, do you have documentation of the development on your property?" My lawyer stood up and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." He placed a thick binder on the desk. Inside were drone images, dated progress shots, even screenshots of the HOA's own website advertising Lakeview Island Resort, a premium member exclusive. She flipped through them slowly. "Did the HOA charge money for use of these cabins?" "Oh, yes, Your Honor," David said. "They've been renting them at $400 a night. The revenue was going straight into the HOA account." That's when the murmurs started in the courtroom. A few residents sitting behind Karen started whispering to each other. Some looked shocked. Some looked angry. Karen tried to regain control. "Your Honor, we were under the impression that the land fell under community easement." The judge raised an eyebrow. "By who?" "Our zoning consultant." The judge frowned. "And this consultant, did they work for the county?" Karen's lips tightened. "No, they were hired by the HOA board." The judge sighed and leaned back in her chair. "So let me get this straight. You built 23 cabins on a privately owned island. You cleared trees, laid septic systems, installed electrical connections, and started collecting rent, all without verifying ownership or obtaining legal permits from the county." Karen opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The judge turned to my lawyer. "Mr. Miller, what damages are you seeking?" David smiled. "Full restitution for unauthorized use of private property, reimbursement for environmental impact and clearing, and ownership of all standing structures as they were built without consent and now reside on his land." The judge nodded slowly. "Seems fair. I'll review the case and issue a written decision." But I could already tell from her face we'd won. After the hearing ended, I walked out into the hallway. Karen stormed out a few minutes later, phone pressed to her ear, yelling at someone. Her sunglasses were off now, and her eyes looked like fire. She glared at me as she passed. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "You just ruined an entire community project." I smiled calmly.
No, Karen, you ruined it yourself. I just owned it. She spun around to say something, but her lawyer pulled her away. 2 weeks later, the judge's decision came in. Full ownership confirmed to me. The HOA was ordered to remove all unauthorized signage, cease any commercial use immediately, and compensate me for 3 months of rental income plus damages. But here's the kicker. The cabins themselves were now legally mine. Every single one. When my lawyer read the ruling out loud, I couldn't help laughing. Karen had basically paid to build me an entire resort. I decided to take a little trip to the island again. This time I wasn't sneaking around with a drone or hiding behind trees. I took my boat right up to the dock, stepped off, and took a long look around. The place was beautiful. Cabins lined up neatly with brand new porches, solar panels gleaming in the sunlight. The air smelled like pine and fresh cut wood. I walked up the hill to where the HOA had built a little check-in office. Inside were still brochures and key racks labeled Cabin 1, Cabin 2, all the way to Cabin 23. They'd left everything behind in a hurry. Computers, furniture, even a coffee maker still plugged in. I picked up one of the glossy pamphlets. It read, Lakeview Island Resort, a proud project by Lakeview HOA. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped it. That night, I sat on the porch of Cabin 1, watching the sunset reflect off the lake. For the first time in months, I felt peace again. But I wasn't done. Oh no. If Karen thought she could get away with this by calling it a misunderstanding, she had another thing coming. I decided to flip their own game against them. You see, the HOA had marketed these cabins hard. Residents had paid deposits, bookings had been made, and demand was high sky. Everyone wanted a spot on Lakeview Island. So I made a new plan. I was going to run it myself. But this time, the money wasn't going to the HOA. It was coming straight to me. I called a few friends in property management and set up a rental system online. Rebranded the place as Miller's Lake Cabins. Same cabins, same lake, just under the actual owner's name now. Within a week, bookings started pouring in. I didn't even have to advertise much. Word spread fast. Everyone wanted to stay in the place that had caused the HOA scandal. But the HOA didn't like that one bit. A few days later, Karen showed up again, this time with 2 board members and a clipboard in hand. I was sitting on the porch drinking coffee when their boat docked. She stepped out in her usual business suit, looking around like she still owned the place. Mr. Miller, this area is still under environmental review. You can't just open a business here. I stood up slowly. Environmental review? You mean the one you skipped when you built all this? Her lips tightened. We're filing an appeal. I shrugged. You can try, but everything here is on private land, legally registered and fully permitted now. The court confirmed it. One of her board members whispered something to her, but she ignored him. She tried again. You're exploiting our community brand name. These cabins were meant for residents. I grinned. Well, now they're for everyone. And guess what? Residents get a discount if they bring proof they resigned from your HOA. Her jaw dropped. You're mocking us. Not mocking, just returning the favor. They left in silence, but I could feel the anger radiating off them like heat waves. Over the next month, the HOA tried everything to shut me down. They filed noise complaints, zoning appeals, even environmental violation reports, all of which failed. The county sided with me every time. The paperwork was airtight. And the best part? The cabins were fully booked every single weekend. Locals came for fishing trips, families for vacations, even honeymooners rented the lakefront cabins. My property value shot up, my bank account grew, and the HOA's reputation went down the drain. By fall, the HOA was bleeding money. They'd spent hundreds of thousands on legal fees, repairs, and refunds to residents who'd booked the cabins before the court ruling. Then one morning, I got a letter. Official HOA stationery, signed by none other than Karen herself. It read, Dear Mr. Miller, the Lakeview HOA Board formally requests to negotiate a lease agreement for continued use of your island facilities for community purposes. I actually laughed out loud. After everything they'd done, they were now asking to pay rent to use my land? So I called my lawyer and said, let's drop a deal, but they're paying premium rates. We met again, this time not in a courtroom, but in my new office cabin. Karen sat across from me, looking like she'd aged 10 years since that first confrontation. She slid a paper across the table. We're prepared to offer a monthly lease of $10,000 for limited community access. I smiled. $25,000, non-negotiable. She sighed. That's unreasonable. Then find another island, I said. She looked out the window at the cabins, at the clear water glistening beyond the trees. There was no other island. Finally, she nodded. Fine. I reached out and shook her hand. Pleasure doing business, Karen. That handshake sealed it. The same woman who once kicked me off my own dock was now paying me rent every single month for cabins her HOA built with their own money. I called my lawyer after she left and said, "You know, David, it almost feels like theft, but the legal kind." He laughed. "No, John, it's just karma." And that night, as I walked along the shoreline, watching the moon reflect off the lake, I realized something. Sometimes revenge doesn't need shouting or fighting. Sometimes you just sit back, let people dig their own hole, and then politely hand them the bill for the shovel. But believe me, the story wasn't over yet, because Karen wasn't the type to let go quietly. In part 3, you'll see what happened when she tried to get that lease canceled, how her plan backfired harder than ever, and how I turned her final scheme into my biggest victory.
For a few months after that deal, everything was calm. The cabins were booked solid, money was flowing in, and the HOA was finally quiet for once. I'd wake up to the sound of waves lapping against the shore, drink my coffee on the porch, and watch the sunrise over the lake that used to be a source of stress. I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen had accepted defeat. But if there's one thing I've learned about HOA presidents like her, they never stop trying to control what isn't theirs. It started with small things. Anonymous complaints filed with the county about noise from my island. Then reports about illegal waste disposal. Then one about unsafe ferry transport. Every time, inspectors came out, looked around, found everything perfectly legal, and left shaking their heads. I kept the place spotless, followed every code, every guideline. But I knew it was her. Karen wanted her control back, and she couldn't stand the fact that the HOA was now paying me rent. Then, one afternoon, in late spring, I got a call from a friend who worked in the county recorder's office. "Hey, John," he said, "you might want to come down here. There's something odd about your island zoning file." When I got there, he showed me a freshly filed document, something labeled Community Integration Addendum. It basically claimed that the island was being reintegrated into the Lakeview HOA boundaries for shared environmental oversight. It had my property name on it, my coordinates, my signature. Except it wasn't my signature. It was forged. I just stared at it. "You're kidding me," I said. He shook his head. "Nope. Filed yesterday by the HOA office. Looks like someone tried to sneak it through." That was it. That was Karen's big move. She was trying to steal it back on paper. I thanked my friend, took photos, and drove straight to my lawyer's office. When I showed him the document, David laughed. "She forged a legal signature? That's criminal, John. We're not even talking civil court anymore. That's fraud." We called the sheriff's department immediately and handed over copies of everything. Within a week, a formal investigation was underway. Meanwhile, Karen had no idea I already knew. She kept playing innocent. I even saw her at a community event one weekend, pretending to make small talk with other residents. "Oh, Mr. Miller," she said sweetly when she saw me. "How's the island business? I hear bookings are going well." I smiled back. "Couldn't be better." "How's the HOA budget these days? Still paying that lease on time?" She gave a fake laugh. "Of course, everything's perfect." I could tell from the way her eyes darted that she was nervous. A few days later, deputies showed up at the HOA office with a search warrant. From what I heard later, it was chaos. Papers everywhere, computers taken, Karen pacing and shouting about misunderstandings. Turns out, it wasn't just my signature she'd forged. She'd been faking several approval forms for community projects to funnel money around without the board's full consent.
When the news hit, it spread like wildfire. Local paper headlines read, HOA president under investigation for fraudulent land claims. Homeowners were furious. Meetings turned into shouting matches. Some demanded she resign. Others wanted the entire board dissolved. Me? I stayed quiet. I let it all unfold. A few weeks later, I was asked to testify. Sitting in that courtroom again, seeing Karen sitting there looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. When the prosecutor asked if I wanted to make a statement, I said, all I ever wanted was to be left alone on my land. They didn't respect that, so I let them finish what they started, and this is where it got them. Karen was charged with document forgery, fraud, and misuse of community funds. She lost her presidency, her reputation, and her grip on everyone around the lake. The HOA itself had to restructure completely, and guess who they reached out to as a community liaison to smooth things over? Yep, me. They offered me a consulting position to help guide property compliance around the lake. I wasn't interested in working for them, but I did accept one thing: access to their records. I wanted to make sure no one could ever pull a stunt like that again. Meanwhile, the island business boomed. With the HOA drama making headlines, everyone wanted to visit the infamous island resort. The cabins were booked out for months. Even people from out of state started showing up. I upgraded the docks, added a few kayaks, and built a little coffee shop near the shoreline where guests could relax and watch the water. I even hired a few locals to help maintain the place. And the best part? Every month, like clockwork, the HOA sent me that lease payment, $25,000, never late, never missed. It became a running joke with my accountant. He'd look at the statement, chuckle, and say, "Looks like HOA rent is due again." Sometimes I'd imagine Karen sitting at home knowing that every time her old HOA paid that bill, they were paying me, the man she once tried to kick off his own island. One summer morning, about a year after it all started, I was sitting at the dock when a familiar voice called from behind me. It was one of the former HOA board members, Steve, one of the few decent people from that mess. He'd left the board after the scandal. "John," he said, "mind if I sit?" "Sure," I said, handing him a cup of coffee. He sighed. "You know, Karen's gone. Moved out of state, house up for sale and everything." I nodded, not surprised. She couldn't stand living here after that. He looked out at the cabins. "Crazy how it all turned out. We thought we were building a community resort, and it ended up being your gold mine." I chuckled. "Guess karma has good timing." He grinned. "What are you going to do with all this now?" I looked around at the trees swaying in the breeze, the cabins reflecting off the lake. I said, "Keep it simple. It's not about the money anymore. It's about peace and keeping people like Karen from thinking they own everything they touch." He nodded quietly. That night, as I watched the sunset, I thought about the whole journey, how it started with a simple visit to my island and ended with a courtroom victory that flipped everything around. I thought about the arrogance, the lies, the way the HOA tried to bury me under paperwork and fake rules, and how all it took was patience and truth to bring it all crashing down. And as the lights from the cabins flickered on, I smiled, because every bulb, every wall, every porch was proof that sometimes the best revenge is just letting people build their own failure with your name on the deed. Months later, I hung a small sign by the dock. It read, "Welcome to Miller's Island, built by the HOA, owned by Karma." Guests always laugh when they read it, not realizing just how true that story is. And every once in a while, when I see another HOA headline pop up online about some neighborhood president overstepping their power, I just shake my head and smile, because I've seen what happens when they mess with the wrong guy. And that's how I turned 23 stolen cabins into my own private paradise. One court order, one forged signature, and a very expensive lesson for Karen and her HOA. So if you ever find yourself dealing with people who think they can walk over you just because they've got fancy titles and clipboards, remember this: you don't need to shout to win. Sometimes you just let them finish the job and then pull out the deed.
Thanks for listening to my story. And hey, if you enjoyed this wild ride, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below, because there's always more HOA karma stories coming your way.